Welcome back. Next up, we've got what is probably the most important section in the course, or at least the most useful as far as the ChatGPT content goes. We're going to talk about prompt engineering, which is basically what it sounds like, writing or engineering the best possible prompts. It's the process of optimizing our input prompts so that we can get the best output, the best results. And it's not specific to ChatGPT. That's what we'll be talking about prompt engineering in the context of ChatGPT. But the general practice of prompt engineering applies to any large language model. ChatGPT is just the most popular. And like any sort of engineering, or really anything in life, it is an iterative process where you try something, it may work, but it probably can be improved, and you can improve it and make it better and try it again, and you keep iterating until you're happy with the result. The quality of your input, the actual prompt that you write, can lead to much better output. So it's really important, right? The only way we can communicate with ChatGPT is through a prompt. And if our prompts are lacking, then our results are lacking. So it's a critical part of working with ChatGPT. It's super useful, but it's also really not that hard. There are courses and books and blog posts and YouTube videos and TikToks trying to sell you on all sorts of crazy garbage around prompt engineering, but it's kind of straightforward. There's a lot of BS in the world of ChatGPT education. There's just a vacuum where there's, a new topic exists out of nowhere. And there's a lot of people who see an opportunity to make money by trying to sell you stuff you don't need or teach you things that you don't really need to worry about. You'll see things like, the 100 incredible prompts that will change your life. Or the worst ones are the ones that promise to make you money. The ultimate money-making ChatGPT prompts, where they're not even really teaching you how to engineer or write a good prompt. They're just selling you a list of prompts or a course, with 100 different prompts in it. There's not a lot of value there, to be honest, because most of them are super specific. Things like, for example, how to write the perfect travel agent prompt to brainstorm a family trip to Disney World using ChatGPT. Do you need to know that? Probably not. It's not that effective to watch somebody write 100 different possible ChatGPT prompts in all the different scenarios. It's really boring and very specific, super niche. So that's exactly what a lot of courses do, is they'll have a whole section on marketing prompts and copywriting prompts and email prompts and resume enhancement prompts and blog post generating prompts. And they're just super bloated, impossible to make it through without falling asleep, but also not that useful. Again, what matters the most is understanding how to write a good prompt. What's a formula to writing a good prompt? Not memorizing hundreds of pre-written prompts other people have done. You can find a prompt for anything online, just by Googling it. But what really helps as far as writing your own good prompts is understanding the key ingredients. And there's really just 4 main key ingredients that we'll talk about in the next video. This whole section is about this winning prompt formula, which honestly sounds kind of salesman scam-like already as I say it, but it's just the key ingredients that you can use to build any prompt. And then I'll have some more specific tips as a separate section, but a lot of those don't apply very often. So that's something I've struggled with here is, I want to show stuff that's useful, and there's some niche things that are useful, but I am not going to do 10 hours of just one prompt after another where I'm boring you to death, and there's not a lot of value there. So this section is getting started with prompt engineering. What are the things that really help to put in a prompt? So let's talk about the ingredients that you can use to make a good prompt. Any prompt, not specific to one genre or one purpose, but just generally the ingredients that make a good prompt. There's 4 main pieces, and they don't always all have to be there. You don't need all of them to make a good prompt, but the 4 categories of information are the initial context or the initializer, the instructions, the task that you're asking the model to perform, any input data, and then constraints and formatting rules. So those 4 things can work together to build pretty much any good prompt on any topic. In this video, we'll talk about the initial context, what that means. So when we're dealing with ChatGPT, remember that this is a model that doesn't really have one specific task, right? It's not trained to be a code enhancing engine or a English translating model or a travel agent or an email writer. It's a general purpose large language model. What can be useful is to give it some specific role, a job, not just the task that's coming next, but instead we can give it some initial context. You are a plagiarism checker. Imagine you are a screenwriter. Act as an English translator and tutor. Or sometimes you can just give it some initial context that is actually setting the stage for us, the user. I'm in a horrible mood today, or I'm a junior web developer trying to ace the coding interview, or I run a company and need help doing X. So you give the model some initial context before asking your question or whatever the task is, which is the second part of the prompt we'll cover in the next video. Initializing this context is as simple as saying something like, act as a JavaScript and React expert, or you are a writing tutor that helps people improve their spelling, writing, and tone. We still haven't provided actual instructions or a task, right? We haven't said correct this sentence or write me an essay or something like that. We've just set the scene and said, this is your job, because it is this omni tool, right, that can do so many things. By narrowing it down, we tend to get better results. We can also do silly things, act as an annoying anime-obsessed teenage boy from Ohio. I'll talk about why it's useful to use the act as syntax in a moment. I'll do that in the next video. There's a reason for it. We can also do things that maybe are a bit more useful. Imagine you are a tech industry hiring expert that specializes in getting your clients jobs at large tech companies. That could be the initial context, and then right below it, I can start to say, ask me interview questions, review my resume, write me a cover letter. There's a million things I can do, but I'm setting the scene here. I'm basically giving it details as to what its job is. But we can also do the same thing for us, the querier, the user. I'm having a terrible day and need someone to listen to me rant and complain about life. Or I am an online course creator and I make courses to help people learn coding and tech-related topics. I can give it that context to tell it a bit about me. And then, of course, the next step is to ask it to do something specific. And this might seem trivial. It is, really. It's such a simple thing to do. All of the prompt engineering concepts are pretty simple. But you put them together, you have a little recipe, a formula, you can make very good prompts. And this is just one small part. Keep that in mind. Here's another example. Act as a Python code reviewing assistant. Or act as an online marketing expert that specializes in ads targeting Gen Z. So those are just some examples. I'll show it in practice in the next video. Again, it comes down to providing some background information as to who or what the model is. You don't have to think of it as a person always, but as some sort of assistant, what type of assistant, and context as to who or what you are, the querier. So I don't want to waste your time showing you a bunch of unnecessary examples of how to set this initial context. It's pretty straightforward. Just give the model a sentence or two or more in certain situations of context as to who it is, what its role is. And you can often get away with just saying you are X. You are a writing tutor. So I'll just show that as our first example. You are an English writing tutor that helps people improve their grammar, spelling, and overall tone. And that's all I need to tell it, right? I didn't even give it a specific task yet. I didn't say fix this paragraph or write me an essay or enhance my resume. I just gave it an overall sort of mission, some context, and then I could just start chatting with it. So again, this is one part of a prompt. We're not quite there to writing a complex prompt yet, but this is one piece. However, it's not always going to work just to say you are X. You are an English writing tutor. It seems fine with that. But if I try something like you are a 12-year-old boy, it's usually, at least sometimes, going to complain and say, no, I'm actually not. I'm an AI. I don't have a physical form, age, or gender. But it will say, I could act like a 12-year-old boy if you want. So that is a strategy that you will see all over the place. Instead of telling the model exactly what it is, you can tell it to imagine it is something or act as something. So you'll see this syntax in my slides. Act as an annoying anime-obsessed teenage boy from Ohio. Imagine you are a tech industry hiring expert. Sometimes you don't need this. Sometimes it won't complain, but a lot of the time it will. And so it's much safer generally just to say, imagine you are X. Act as X. So I'll do the same thing. Act as a 12-year-old boy. And it will still usually say, okay, I'll role play. I'm still not a 12-year-old boy, but I can act as one. So, and then it starts going, oh, wow, have you seen the latest video game that just came out? That's pretty much it for this video. Main takeaways here are that, well, we set the context and that does a lot just on its own without providing a specific task. Just telling it something about us or about it, the model, and how it should behave, that sets the scene. And then also using the act as or imagine as syntax can be helpful because sometimes the model's not very happy if you tell it that it is something that it actually is not. It is not an annoying anime-obsessed teenage boy, but it can act like one. So the next piece of our prompt formula is the most important. It's the actual task, the true instruction. What is the question or the thing we want answered? Respond to this email. Improve this short story. Write a JavaScript function that generates prime numbers. Write me a cover letter. Suggest a restaurant to eat at in Paris. There's, whatever the task is, we have an actual task in the prompt. So I'm using some color coding to try and differentiate between the initial context setting and then in red, the actual question or task. So act as an online marketing expert that specializes in ads targeting Gen Z. That's setting the scene. And then the actual question or task, write a tweet promoting my new course on ChatGPT Prompt Engineering for beginners. Or setting the stage, you are the pastry chef in a 3 Michelin-starred restaurant. Come up with a high-concept dessert involving liquid nitrogen. So we're providing information up top, and then afterwards coming up with a specific question or task. I live in USDA hardiness zone 4. This is information about me, the user, right? And if you're not familiar with hardiness zones, it's as far as gardening and growing plants and fruits and vegetables, there's different zones in the US that are based on how much snow and frost and temperature and a whole bunch of stuff. Anyway, I live in zone 4. Generate me a list of dates when I should start specific vegetables as seeds and when I should transplant them outdoors. So we have the task, and then we had information up top about me this time. One more example, act as a middle school geography teacher. Write a quiz with 4 multiple choice questions about the countries of South America. Now, of course, you could just say, write a quiz with 4 multiple choice questions about the countries of South America. But if you tell it to act as a middle school geography teacher, or if you say, I am a middle school geography teacher, write me a quiz for my students, we're providing more information, more context, and we can get a much better result. Because otherwise, what skill level would it write this quiz for? Who would the audience be? Adding that little sentence up top with that context can make a big difference. Now, as far as what the actual tasks are, the possibilities are kind of limitless, right? We could ask it to summarize things, translate things, explain things, write code, extract keywords, pretty much whatever you want, tell a joke. That is not what this section is focused on, right? There's so many possibilities there. What I want to focus on here is just the structure of a prompt. So whatever you're trying to do, you have your context, initialize that context, then you have the actual task at hand, whatever the task is. We'll see plenty of examples of real prompts and writing all the stuff, from scratch, but I just want to move quickly here. With that said, I'll show a handful of quick examples. So here's an example that doesn't have any initial context. It just says, write a tweet promoting the launch of my new book called Mastering the Python Coding Interview. And it writes me a tweet. Excited to announce the launch of my latest book, Mastering the Python Coding Interview, blah, blah, blah. It's sort of generic, but it's not terrible. And then here's an example where I kept the exact same task, write a tweet promoting the launch of my new book, but right before it, I said, you are a high-profile JavaScript influencer. And the tweet that it gave me is a little bit more interesting and definitely more specific, right? Stepping outside my JavaScript comfort zone to highlight an extraordinary new resource. So it's a JavaScript influencer who's selling a Python book. Doesn't really matter if you're not familiar with either of those tools. But the point is that we get a different result by being more specific and providing some initial context. Then, of course, we can get way more varied with the actual tasks that we give it. We could say, write a tweet promoting the launch of my new book, or we could do something like write, 3 tweets. That's a simple example, but we'll get a very different output. 3 tweets promoting the launch of my new book. And while that's going, we could try something completely different. Write me a script for a 30-second TikTok video to teach people about, let's say, JavaScript variables and let versus const. So same initial context, you're a high-profile JavaScript and coding influencer, very, very different task. And we'll see how it does. By the way, here's our 3 tweets. So 3 completely different tweets. They're all kind of similar because it's all about the same topic. It's not the most inspiring, but 3 different tweets. We've got emojis in there. We could tell it not to include emojis. There's a whole bunch of things we can do as far as the format. So I know that this video is pretty obvious, right? You can provide a task to ChatGPT, and you should provide a task. That goes without saying. What I think makes more of an impact is having that task preceding it with some sort of context, some general information. And here's the TikTok script that it wrote for me. Not too bad. The next component in a good prompt is any necessary input data. Now, not every prompt needs this, but a lot of the time you'll have some information that you need to provide to the model. So you have your instructions, you have the context, the instructions, and then you have the input data. And it's recommended that you do follow this order. You have your context set first, then the task, and then any input data. So let me just show you an example here. Something like this. You are a spelling and grammar checking assistant. That's setting the context. Given the following input text, please correct any mistakes and improve the overall quality of the writing. That is the task. And then we have the actual input data. My name is called Steele and I have too many pets, a lot of spelling and grammar issues in there. So that's the input in yellow here. It's a silly example. Here's another one. Generate an outline for a 1,000-word essay based on the following prompt. And then we have the actual input. How will ChatGPT change the ways we work? It can sometimes be useful to wrap your input, if it's actual text, wrap the input in quotes, or do something like this right here. Act as the world's best cover letter writer. So that's our initial context. Then we have the task. I will give you the job description for a role I'm applying for, and you will write me a concise and effective cover letter. And then, instead of just including the job description, we can say, here is the job description, just to make it clear. Sometimes the model can get tripped up when there's just a bunch of text, and some of that text is instructions, and some of the text is data. So it can be useful to separate it out and say, here is the description, or even just write the word description : It's very flexible, but that's one example. So let's try that. Let's find a job description. I'm on the OpenAI website. Let's say I want to become a research scientist at OpenAI. I can take all this information. I don't know how much of this. Wow, that's a pretty nice compensation range. Let's see how much of this we want. Probably just the about the role, we expect you, and nice to have maybe. Let's just start with that, just for the sake of time. So act as the world's best cover letter writer. That's our initial context. I will give you the job description for a role I'm applying for, and you will write me a concise and effective cover letter. Then, I'm hitting Shift Enter, by the way, just to format this for myself. I can then provide here, let's see, here is the job description. And then I'll just paste it here. And that should do it for me. So as long as I'm telling it, this is now separate from all the instructions. It usually can figure it out anyway, but by using this signifier, here is the description, it can be helpful. Another thing you'll see some people do is separate their instructions from their data using some sort of character, an arrow or an equal sign, dashes. There's a lot of options. It doesn't really matter. Now let's see what it does. Okay, so it wrote me a cover letter. It is, I've already read it. It's decent. There are some problems. Of course, first of all, it just leaves space for us to put our name and contact info in, which makes sense. But also, it kind of lies. We didn't give it any specific details about us, the user or the person that the cover letter is being written for, and that's something we could definitely provide as input. This video is not really about writing a cover letter writing prompt. We'll have a separate video later on when I talk about, specific prompts, and one of those prompts will be a resume and cover letter writing prompt. That's not the focus here. The main takeaway from this video is just the concept of providing input data, of being able to say, here is your context, here is your job or your task, and here's the information you need to complete it. Here's your input data. And there's many different formats. You can provide data as text like this. You can provide data as a table, as JSON, as code. We'll see some of those examples later. For now, just know we often need to provide data. There's one more component to good prompts, or at least some good prompts, which is adding in any constraints and output formatting information. So in addition to the actual task, write me a resume or make me a list of coffee shop names, we also can specify requirements that further narrow down or restrict the type of output we want. Make me a numbered list. Make me a comma-separated list. Use 2 to 3 sentences. Respond only with certain words, yes or no. Generate me a table. Generate me markdown content. Write me a Python function. There are so many different ways that we can constrain the output that we get. So a simple example, explain microprocessors. That's the task. To a middle schooler using fewer than 200 characters. That's not easy to do, but we're constraining it. Tell me a joke. Your output should contain every letter of the alphabet at least once. So a pretty serious constraint there. I don't know why we would do that, but it is a fun demo. It does work. And it's a serious restriction on the type of output it can generate. Now, here's a more useful example. Up top, I'm setting the context, right? I'm initializing the scene. You are leading an interview for a front-end developer role at a tech company. I will be the candidate, and you will ask me interview questions. And then we have restrictions on how it should work. Ask me one question at a time. Once I have responded, rate my answer to your question on a scale from 1 to 10, and then ask the next question. So a lot of this is it blends together. You kind of intertwine the restrictions or the constraints with the actual instructions. I'm just trying to identify these key elements that can make up a prompt. So here's another one. We set the scene, the context, act as a news article summarizer. Then we have the instructions. I will provide you with an article and you will create a summary of the main points, and then certain constraints on the output. Your summary should include a 2-sentence overview of the article and then 4 to 6 bullet points. Your summary should not include any direct quotes from the paper. Your response should be no more than 100 words. Here is the article text. So at this point, I'm providing the input data. So this prompt actually includes all the different aspects we've talked about. Initializing the context, providing the actual instructions, providing input data, which presumably would come after this. It just was too long to fit into this slide. And then restricting the output or constraining it. One more example, write a 3-paragraph blog post on why live coding interviews are a terrible method of assessing developer candidates. So that is the task. And then this one's a little different. Your response should be formatted as Markdown. We'll talk more about Markdown as a separate video, but this is another output format that we can specify. And something that can be useful sometimes is to basically show the format that you want, to visualize the exact syntax. Now, a lot of the time, you just want to generate text, paragraphs of text. It doesn't really matter how it's formatted, but if you ever need something specific, and this comes up a lot if you're working with things like Excel, you're working with programming languages, JSON, comma-separated lists, SQL, where you need an exact format for the output, you can actually show it what you want. So generate me a list of 10 potential names for a ski town, coffee shop, and bakery. Sure, maybe we're starting a new business. And then I say, here is the output format I want. And if we use this syntax with the angle braces, this is just one option. It's smart enough to know that these are going to be replaced with actual names. So it's just another way of specifying the format, right? So I could do something like generate me a list of the top 10, deadliest reptiles. And usually it's going to give me a numbered list by default, although it's going to hedge a bunch and tell me that it's hard to say what deadliest truly means, but you can see it's giving me a numbered list. And maybe this is what I want, but if I'm doing something, and this is a very specific example, but if I'm doing something where I just want the names, I don't need all this explanation, all this paragraph stuff. I can get more specific. I can even just tell it, all right, stop. And I can say, generate me a list of the top 10 deadliest reptiles, only include the name of the animal. So I'm specifying some of the format here, and follow this output format. And then I'll just do name 1, comma, name 2, comma, name 3, and we'll get a very different result, as you can see right here. And as soon as I hit stop, I could even tweak this. Oops, stop generating. And I could come up with a completely different format if I wanted to. If I want them to be separated by arrows, I don't know why I would do this, but I can. And you can see it works just fine. So the point here is not that this is particularly useful, but it is very useful to specify output formatting in general. And we'll do this in pretty much all of the prompts we write, it helps to be specific about what you want. Sometimes you do have a specific format you have to adhere to, but other times it's more about setting constraints as to the length or the audience, right? So I want a 2-sentence overview, then I want bullet points. Don't use direct quotes from a paper. Make sure the whole response is under 100 words. This is not as specific, I would say, as specifying this format, but it still is specifying a format, specifying the output, how we want the output to look, what it should contain. And this is a really important part of pretty much any prompt that you'll write. Okay, so let's try putting some of these pieces together to build a prompt. Let's do an article summarizer, a Wikipedia summarizer, some sort of summarizer to start. So what I'm going to do, first of all, I have a large article that I've copied the text of onto my clipboard. It's an article it's from TechCrunch, the startup Anthropic, I don't know how you actually say it. It's a sort of an OpenAI competitor that has just raised a big round, Series C of $450 million. But it's a much longer article. I want to get the key points, but I don't want to have to read them all myself. So what I'm going to do is ask ChatGPT to do it. And, this could be honestly useful, especially if you save the prompt somewhere, then you can just rerun it with a different article each time. So I would start with our initializer, right? What's the initial context? Where I'm going to say you are or act as a article summarizing assistant. Okay. And then the next step is going to be the actual instructions. I will provide you with the text of a news article, and I'd like you to generate a summary. Act as an article summarizing assistant. Now what I'm going to do is give it the constraints. So I could give it the article first. This is something I see people do sometimes, where they'll put here is the article, and then put the article in here, and then at the very end say, make sure the summary is X and Y, 200 characters, has bullet points, no more than 10 sentences, whatever the rules are. I find that it's much better to put your input data as the last thing whenever possible. There's less chance of it getting confused, so I can put all of my sort of prompt instructions up top, the constraints, and then at the end, give it the data. So up here, I'll set my constraints, and it's up to us, but I'm thinking I want, some bullet points, so I'm going to tell it that. I'd like you to generate the summary. The summary should let's start with should include maybe a 2-sentence overall summary, and then also include 4 to 6 bullet points summarizing the key aspects, the key points of the article. Okay, we can start with that. So we have our initial scene setting. We have the actual instructions. I want you to make me a summary. And then we have the specific constraints, a 2-sentence overall summary, and also 4 to 6 bullet points summarizing the key points of the article. Your total output, and then I'm going to say should not exceed 200 words, 100 words, 120 words, some limit there. So I don't want a massive summary. And then finally, I'll say here is the article text and provide that text. And then I can just paste it in. I like to definitely do it on a new line. And what you'll see some people do is actually separate their input data from the rest of the prompt using a character like this, or some of the documentation on OpenAI will use hash symbols, octothorpes. Anything works. It's just a way to differentiate the stuff I'm saying versus the actual article content. Then I'll place or paste the article in there, and I'll hit enter. And it'll take a little bit, but we should get a nice response. So here's our first summary. Generative AI startup Anthropic, co-founded by OpenAI veterans, has secured $450 million in a Series C funding round. Okay. And then we have the key points. What did we get? 5 individual bullet points. So a pretty simple example of writing a prompt, but it does include a lot of what we've just covered. So I'm not trying to tell you this prompt will change your life necessarily, but it includes the sort of act as or imagine, here's the context declaration, the initial context, an actual prompt, instruction, a query, some sort of task, summarize a news article, some constraints on the output and how it should be formatted, its length, and then some input. In this video, I'm going to show how we can use ChatGPT to summarize YouTube videos using the transcripts from a YouTube video. So this is a YouTube video by one of my friends, Kyle. He runs a channel called Web Dev Simplified. He put out a 12-minute video on our new frameworks replacing React. Now, he makes very good videos, but I don't have time to watch that. So what I can do is go down to any YouTube video that has any sort of subtitles, click this More button, and go to Show Transcript. And unfortunately, there's no easy way just to copy the transcript with a single click. I have to scroll and highlight all of this. It's still faster, probably, than watching the entire video. And then I'll copy that and keep it on my clipboard. Now, I'm going to write my prompt. We'll do something like, you are a YouTube video transcript summarizer. I will provide you with the transcript of a YouTube video, and you should generate a summary of the video's contents. Now, that's our basic setup, right? The initial context and then the actual instructions, or the task. I'm going to provide the video transcript at the end, so I can go ahead and put that in here. I'll just hit Shift Return a couple of times, and then I'll throw the data in. This is the transcript, and I'll even, space it out maybe with some characters. I'll put the transcript in there. There we go. And then I can tell it exactly what sort of format I want, right? That's the final piece we discussed, specifying the constraints in the format. Honestly, I could be fine with just any sort of summary that it generates me, but I could also give it more details. Your summary should be concise and no more than 200 words. And I'll say the summary should be a series of bullet points, if that's what we want. It's kind of similar to what we did in the previous videos, but a series of bullet points, just to show another example. Okay, so I have not seen this video, to be clear. I've skipped around a couple of times, so this is a somewhat real example, because I love you, Kyle, but I'm not going to watch 12 minutes. I don't know if I've ever watched a 12-minute YouTube video. My attention span is completely destroyed. But it's giving me some really nice bullet points. So the video introduces the JS ecosystem, questions whether React is becoming outdated due to new frameworks. He concludes it's not dying. Its retention percentage is high. I mean, you can read this, right? There's no, you may not know what React is. It doesn't really matter. You can put any YouTube video in here if you can get a transcript. We can also do this with more complex transcriptions, including things from podcasts. A lot of podcasts today will include on their website all sorts of free transcriptions of the actual podcast contents. One of the most popular podcasts that does this is the podcast This American Life, which I actually really enjoy listening to. I probably wouldn't need a summary of an episode. But what I can do is take some of this transcript. Now, you'll run into trouble if you try and summarize the entire hour episode. And we've talked about this before, that you can't just feed it a full book, right? There's a maximum size in terms of the number of tokens, and a full podcast that's an hour long is far too long. But there's a chunk in here that's like a 20-minute interview. I've already copied it onto my clipboard. This guy, Shalom Oslander, and Ira Glass, the host, they're having a conversation. Really, it's mostly Shalom telling a story about one hockey game that he tried to go to, I think is what it was. Anyway, if I wanted to generate me a summary following this pattern that we've been doing, we'll start with, you are a podcast summarizing assistant. Given a podcast transcript, please generate a summary of the podcast. And then let's get more detailed. In addition to the summary of the podcast's contents, also include a summary of how many speakers were involved and how many words each speaker said. I don't know if we really care about that, but just to get a sense of, how one-sided the conversation is, just as another example. And then I'll say, here is the transcript. And then I paste the transcript in here, and you can see the format. It has the speaker's name, and then what they say, and then the speaker name and what they say. So let's see what happens. I'm going to click Regenerate Response. Okay, let's see how it goes. Tells us a bit about the episode, about Shalom, the story, or Orthodox Jews who wanted to go to a soccer game or a hockey game, but it was on the Sabbath, so they couldn't drive there. They decided to walk 14 miles. And then we can see the approximate word count. Now, I don't really have an easy way of checking this, but it seems relatively accurate that, the guy being interviewed said twice as many words as the interviewer. So just another example of providing transcripts and getting a summary. And yet another example of this basic pattern, a template, a formula for a prompt. You give it the initial context, you initialize it, you say this is what you are, this is what you do, and then we give it a specific task, generate a summary, and then any constraints in addition to that task, how many words, what tone we want, who's the audience, what format, and then any input data, which in this case was the podcast transcript.